not exactly where I expected to be, but I'm in a cafe, so I have internet, I have tea. Life could be a lot worse, right?
Okay.
And, you know, I thought about what to say, whether to tell a story or talk about storytelling, but I thought I might begin by talking a little bit about my own process as a writer. Because, especially when I am writing fiction, because I'm hearing that a lot of you are interested in writing and storytelling, in creating stories. And, you know, there are basically two different ways that people approach that. There are those people who sit down, think out their plot, think out their story, think out their characters, outline it all, you know, plan it all out, and then sit down and write it. And I am not one of those. Then there are those who kind of catch on to a nugget or a hint of something, start writing about it, and then let it see where it takes you. So when I was writing The Fifth Sacred Thing, which is my novel that is set in a future which seems to be coming closer by the moment, where Northern California has become a beautiful, ecofeminist, diverse, balanced, wonderful place, and Southern California has gone the opposite direction. And the story really centers around the conflict of what happens when the South invades the North, and the North has to figure out, how do you resist oppression without becoming what you're fighting against? And for me, that's how fiction begins. It generally begins for me with a question that I'm wrestling with. Like that one, I had been doing a lot of research about the transition in ancient times from matrifocal culture to patriarchy, and how that happened. And it became clear to me that a lot of the way that it happened had to do with war, and had to do with not just conquest, but also how cultures had to change in order to resist that conquest. You know, peaceable cultures that had lived in harmony for hundreds of years, sometimes thousands, when they were invaded by these more warlike cultures that came off the steppes of Central Asia and invaded Europe, and also went the other way and invaded India. You know, it wasn't just the places that they conquered, it was what each culture had to do in order to respond and in order to resist. And I was really struggling with that, because I had been a nonviolent activist for many, many years, and I really believe very strongly in the philosophy of nonviolence. And yet I'm also Jewish by birth, and I looked at the history of the Holocaust. I always felt like I would hope that I would have been in the resistance in Germany if I had been there at that time. And I don't see that that could have been a completely nonviolent resistance once the Nazis took power. So how do you wrestle with these things? You can write essays about them, you can do research projects about them. But for me, one of the ways I like to approach them is by turning them into story, into characters. So in The Fifth Sacred Thing, the characters are all struggling with that question in different ways. And in some ways, each one kind of has a different position on it. There's one character, Lily, who's really very strongly the voice of complete nonviolence in the book. And then there's Bird, who is young and had gone off fighting in the Southlands, and was very hurt and very damaged from his experiences there, and no longer really believes nonviolence is practical because he's experienced the brutality firsthand. And then there's Madrone, who's the healer, who ends up going to the Southlands and, you know, going through her own changes around that. So the other thing that, again, for me, is part of that process, oftentimes it'll be a funny image or an idea or something. And that book for me really started with the image of this man, a young man coming back from the war, coming down through the city streets, very much hurt, very much broken, walking through this beautiful, transformative place and feeling like he no longer belongs and wondering who's alive and who's dead. And at the time, I really had no idea who he was. I had that question in my mind. I knew I wanted to write a story about it. I had no idea where it was going to go. And I just started writing the scene and then writing scenes around it and then saying, well, what might have happened before and what might have happened before that and what might happen after that. And that's probably why I don't write a lot of novels. Because it just kind of meanders along for a while, and then eventually I have to go and prune it all down. When I wrote The Fifth Sacred Thing, I actually was also writing what became Walking to Mercury, which is the prequel. And at one point I had this vision of a story that was, you know, that went from like 1950 when Maya was born to 2050. It spanned that whole century. And then one day, that was the early days of computers, and I had all these files, and one day I printed them all out, and I had a stack of paper that was about 2 feet tall. And I realized this is never going to work. I have to make some choices and divide this up into 2 different books because there's just too much here.
Do you have a specific process when working with story, and especially when, I mean, I love hearing how you, it sounds like you really followed the impulse. You saw this one image and then the story revealed itself to you. And I was just curious, what was inside of you? Like, did you know that you wanted to write a vision story? Were you really aware of where the world was headed and how much something like that was needed? Or did you really truly be that such a humble listener just to follow the story and then let it reveal itself to what it wanted to be?
I knew I wanted to write a story that centered around that question of how can we respond to violence without becoming what we're fighting against. And it was really a question of, do I set this in the past and do a historical novel? But I had done a whole lot of research writing Truth or Dare, Encounters of Power, Authority, and Mystery, and there's a whole historical chapter in there about that transition. And again, it was the very early days of computers. I had this little tiny computer that didn't even have a hard drive. It had 2 floppy disks, and each disk could hold maybe a chapter's worth of material. And I had this one chapter with 93 footnotes, and every time I got to footnote 92, the whole thing crashed. And so I wanted to write something that didn't require any footnotes or any research. And so I decided that meant maybe setting it in the future. And I wanted to do something where the research would involve things like backpacking through Big Sur. So I did. I went backpacking through Big Sur. I went by myself and hiked in 10, 12 miles into this beautiful canyon, whereupon I hurt my foot and started to feel like I had the flu, and woke up and was just hot and feverish and hurting. And somehow in all of that, the whole scene about Seder and the prophet Elijah coming and speaking to Maya, all of that kind of came through in some of that sort of feverish whatever. So yeah, I think for me, I think it's important for all our creative process. You know, I have a number of different phases with it. And the first phase, I think it's really important just to let it flow. So I usually write a first draft where I try to quiet that inner censor, that voice that's telling you, this is no good, you know, or, oh, this is stupid, or you can't write, or somebody else, Margaret Atwood is a much better writer than you'll ever be. And it's sort of a mental state I call writer's syndrome, where you kind of bounce back and forth between, this is like complete piece of shit, to this is the greatest thing ever written. Like, these words, this sentence alone is going to completely transform the world. And then the next minute, it's like, oh, this is terrible. This is crap. What are you thinking of? And you can really drive yourself crazy with that. And I think, you know, for me, I've learned over the years, many, many years of doing this, just to like tell it to shut up. Because in the end, you're going to write something. Some people are going to like it. Some people are not going to like it. Is it great literature? Is it crap? You probably don't know. You know, people thought Moby Dick was a terrible piece of writing until decades after it was published. Sometimes it takes the world maturing to appreciate what you've done. So in the end, if you can just give yourself the space to create without judging, for me, that's the first draft. And it's also the hardest draft. It takes a lot of creative energy. It can be exhausting. It's like you're literally pulling the stuff out of your own energetic field. And then I let it sit for a bit and go back and do a second draft. And that second draft is where you invite the critic back in and start structuring, saying, okay, because often I'll have many, many different scenes or things that will come up and have no idea how they all fit together. And that's where I try to give it a structure, a flow. And I think of writing and I think of structure kind of the way I think of structuring a ritual, which is also kind of like structuring a 3-act play. I always tell people that the first act is sort of setting the stage, setting the scene, creating the sacred space, setting up the world that the story takes place in. Then the second act is where the conflict gets going, the drama, you know, the questions get posed, the stresses get employed. And then the third act, which is often many times the shortest, also in ritual, is when you wrap everything up and complete it and bring it together. So there are many different theories about how you structure a drama, how you structure a novel. You know, there's millions of books on screenwriting in particular that'll tell you, like, practically beat by beat, page by page, you know, a structure for it. I don't mind those things. As a writer, I find them, you know, it's kind of like writing a sonnet or something. If there's something with clear rules and directions, it's kind of fun to follow them and see what you get. But really, I look at it more as a process of energy. How do you create the field where the energy can move? How do you then have a flow of energy that rises and falls and rises and falls and eventually reaches some kind of climax? And finally, how do you bring it to some kind of satisfactory conclusion? So to me, that's the second part, the work of the second draft. And then the third, fourth, fifth, 10th, whatever, multiple drafts that follow are also inviting the critic back in, but really refining and looking at the language and saying, oh, okay, does this really say exactly what I mean? Is there a way I can say this that might be stronger? Is this metaphor I'm using a cliche? Is there a more original way I can say that? And I often find, you know, the pieces of my writing that I think of maybe as most beautiful or other people do, often for me, they don't come until the third draft or the fourth or the very, very end. Because once the world is created and once the structure is laid down, then that opens up the space for the words to flow. I'm wondering, it's become very noisy behind me. I don't know if you're hearing that. Sorry about that.
I'm so impressed you're able to maintain such a focused stream of thought. Yes, you definitely are dealing with a loud background. But
it was really quiet when I first sat down here. I see someone asking, how did the process of writing the fifth sacred thing impact your personal story? That's, you know, that's an interesting question. You know, for me, well, first of all, writing fiction was something I had always wanted to do. And I'm just trying to think if there's, I don't know if there's anywhere I can move here that actually has a plug that's quieter. So I apologize for all that. But, you know, and I had written novels before that never got published. So the process of writing the fifth sacred thing for me was partly the process of, you know, making my own personal story come true. Sorry, I don't know.
When you talk into the mic, it does help.
Does it? Okay,
yeah.
Great. Yeah.
Also, I don't know if there's I don't know if you have a table right outside, and if the weather's kind enough. I know I've done that a couple times.
I could try moving outside. My batteries.
Yeah.
Let me try moving outside for a moment and see how long my battery will last. Chat among yourselves.
Okay. You know, I think that one of the beautiful things that this time is asking of us is to really get really clear about how do we go with the flow. You know, and I know everyone's saying it's fine with the sound. I think it's an issue of Starhawk being able to actually focus. It's really hard to give as much as she's giving when there's that much distracting you. So that's why I think it's worth us taking a nice pause and seeing if she can get to a place where she doesn't have so much distraction for herself in the background. And yeah, it's such an interesting time. I'm gonna go back and just take a look at everybody because it's kind of fun. A lot of you have turned off your video. And one of the things, hi, Sasha, nice to see you. This is certainly not the sacred silence you referenced, Leah. You know, it's true. It's, you know, but I think she's demonstrating a couple of things for us right now in terms of sometimes when you stand up and you're talking story, right, there's these two things that are happening. You have there's the ego, there's the part that there's a learned wisdom that we have to give. And then there's that eloquence, there's that spirit moving through us, right? There's that being so connected to you that we can hear what's naturally being called for. And to that, like being able to hold that space, it's so much easier when you've got some silence. You're not being distracted by a million things. And yet it's also an amazing skill that she's actually been demonstrating for us quite well, because she has been able to stay incredibly focused, even though there's all this distracting sound. And just to share with you, she got stuck in some horrible traffic. And so in order to be with us, she wasn't able to make it all the way home. And that's why she's at a coffee shop. And bless her be for finding a way of being with us. And so we're getting to see that. And Lena's saying, there is the real of being out of control in spite of preparation. I know, you know, and it's like, I really feel like as soon as you say yes to something, maybe it's a course, maybe it's a ceremony, it's like the learning begins when you say your yes, you know. So of course, you know, our learning begins just with learning about what does it take? What do you need to be able to bring your story in? What kind of focus do you need? And how, what skills can you practice so that you can focus and so that you can manage all these things coming at you? If any of you have seen me in webinars, I go a little crazy when everything's moving around. Okay, oh, we got the moon in the background. We're gonna take you off mute. I think you have to take yourself off mute, unfortunately, because I think you put yourself on mute.
Okay, how's that?
There, that's great.
Yeah, I think
How
that
are
may
you?
actually be a street light, but we'll call it the moon, right?
And I was like, I don't think we're actually in a full moon, but it sure does look like it where you
Yeah.
are.
Okay. So we'll see how long the battery lasts here, but hopefully it'll be okay.
Okay.
It's really, I don't know what they were doing in there. It sounded like they were beating the coffee to death, bean by bean. I'm looking at some of the questions. How do I balance the writer's life with relationship, community, house activists, rituals, etc.? Good question. You know, I don't know. At this point, I feel like I have not been able to carve out space since I wrote City of Refuge to actually start doing another piece of writing. And I'm trying to figure out how to do that because I've been involved in so much teaching and permaculture and organizing and running a nonprofit. Writing something like a novel for me takes like a period of mental space, you know, where I have like a month or a couple months even to start it, where I can get into a rhythm and wake up in the morning. You know, what I like to do is wake up in the morning, go out in the back deck, meditate, have my first cup of tea, and then write, and not turn the internet on until I've done my writing for the day. And then maybe answer some emails or whatever I have to do, and then get out of the house and go and take a long walk or garden or do something outside and outdoors, something physical. And then generally by the evening, that would be time to relax. That to me is idyllic. Unfortunately, it's really hard to make enough money from writing to get the space and time to do the writing. So at this point, I feel like it's, I haven't been able to be in that space now for quite a long time. And I hope I will get back to it, but it probably won't be this year because I have so much travel lined up for this year. Yeah, I
really
do
appreciate you speaking.
Yeah.
I just appreciate you speaking to the truth of a couple of things that you've said, which I really appreciate, is that sense of how much energy it takes to create.
Yeah.
That it, like, especially that first draft, that it literally is, and that's, these guys have heard me talk a lot about this need for psychic silence, where there's no phone on, and you're not having all the things needed from you, and you can actually be quiet enough to listen. And just the challenge of what it is to carve that space out in the world that we live in.
Yeah.
And yet how much we, because my gosh, your vision stories, like, I can't say enough. I mean, I remember before reading that book, the only image that I had of our future was, of Armageddon, not the true meaning of the word, but like, how many people think of the end of times. And that was literally like, I couldn't even see myself there. And so I think one of the things I'm really and that your book was the first book where I was like, oh, I see a future that I want to become part of, and actually live in and be, play a role in. And I'm just thinking about how meaningful and valuable it is to fight for that creative space that you speak about, and how worthy it is to find a way, for all of us to get that creation space.
Yeah, the times when I've been doing full out, activism and out there on the streets and stuff, I have done some writing, like oftentimes I'd write a blog or keep a journal, but that's a different kind of writing. It's not creative writing in the same way, because the events are so overwhelming that you don't, for me, I need that reflective time. And I'm not one of those people that just instantly can, spew out great responses on the internet to everything. Like, I like to think about something and chew it over and revise it. If I'm going to put something out that represents me, I like to think of it carefully about how the writing is done. So I see the question again, how did the process of writing the fifth sacred thing impact my personal story? It's a great question. I just don't know if I can answer it.
I'd love to clarify it a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering how addressing the question of how do we do this in a nonviolent way, which I just finished reading it, so it's fresh in mind, and you answer the question, but how did working through that answer in the process of writing a pretty meaty book impact how you were living, and did it impact your story? Like, are you different because of the work you did on that book, other than maybe your foot?
Luckily my foot healed at that point.
That's good.
Well, the thing about that book, because everybody reads it and thinks it's a book about nonviolence, but the actual way that they get rid of the Army of the South, spoiler alert here, is not so much completely nonviolence. It's that they basically convert enough of the army that the army turns on itself. And so I don't know that it impacted me. I mean, I was a nonviolent activist before, and I was a nonviolent activist after. I would say I was maybe more impacted around that, or started wrestling with other questions around that, both through going to Palestine and doing support for the nonviolent resistance there and being in that situation, because I had always fondly believed that a nonviolent movement among the Palestinians, you know, and the Israelis would, like, you know, open their hearts and, you know, justice would come, you know, in a minute. And then when I actually went there and experienced it, I realized, oh, well, there already was a nonviolent resistance among the Palestinians that had been going on for decades. And that was not how the Israelis were responding. They were responding with more and more repression and brutality. You know, so I think, and then being part of the global justice movement, where we kind of came out of this framework of, you know, having been the anti-nuclear movement and lots of the anti-war movements and the anti-intervention movements, and nonviolence was just an assumption. And then being confronted with all these youthful activists who wanted to mask up and throw rocks through windows and believed in diversity of tactics and trying to negotiate, how do we work with them? Do we refuse to work with them? Do we go along with them? You know, and finally coming around to say, well, maybe the thing to do is to be there and be a nonviolent presence and model it and embody it rather than preach about it. And that all impacted City of Refuge, which is the sequel to the Fifth Sacred Thing. The Occupy movement in particular, because for me, the central question in that book became, how do we actually create the new world when people are so deeply damaged by the old? So,
And that's the Mercury one?
no, that's City of Refuge.
Okay,
Which is,
it's on my list. Now I've got to get that one.
okay.
That's
great.
my question.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting because I'm on the Big Island right now, and there's a massive move to protect Mauna Kea. And if any of you are not following this, it's not getting as much attention as it could be, but you can actually watch a live stream. And they're doing, and the distance that I'm hearing between the difference between just being nonviolent and that healing and the trauma is like, they consciously sing every time the police come. They recently had 300 armed policemen come down to rip down a tiny little library, children's library that they've built. And the trauma that shows up in the bodies of the people that are there, and it's cold up there. It's on Hawaii, but it's actually really freaking cold up there. And they literally gather around and they chant and they sing. And that's what they've done. And every single time so far, they've been able to, and they actually have a whole team of people that are trauma specialists that work with people and actively bring people out that get too triggered and would instill violence. So there's a whole system of working in a village mindedness of what it takes to be able to hold that kind of strength and that kind of love consciousness, you know. And I love that they're doing something in the space of not being violent, and they're using their voices and their heart and their song. One of the things I had that came up with me listening to you, Starhawk, is being such a leader in the goddess movement, you know, and I think for a lot of people, you know, my age, I'm standing on, it's like there was space for our voices to be heard. I'm watching, you know, millennials, it's like they just expect to be heard. You know, we have such different relationships, you know, in terms of what it is to be a woman with a voice, and really recognizing your leadership and the emergence of the goddess movement. And I think the core of my question is, how did you know when it was your turn to speak? Literally, and like inside of you or outside of you, like what was your process in walking that path?
Can you say that again? Just,
yeah,
I got distracted
it's
reading a question, so I can't read the chat and talk at the same time. I'm not a millennial.
I know.
Multitask like that.
Right. So the question is around you being a leader in the goddess movement, and at a time when it wasn't like, you know, you just open your mouth or open your mouth as a woman and people were there ready to listen. And how did you know when it was your turn to speak? How did you know it was your turn to bring something forward that that a lot of people weren't familiar with or remembering?
Well, you know, I am a woman, so I had that acculturization of, you know, listening. I remember one of my dear friends, her mother always told her, you know, boys will like you better if you listen instead of talking. But I'm also Jewish, so I had another acculturization from that part of my background where everybody talks all the time and nobody, like I remember when I have taught courses and workshops in Israel, really being struck by how much time I would spend encouraging people to speak and making it okay for people to speak. And they'd be looking at me like I was out of my mind, like it had never remotely occurred to anyone that if they thought of something to say, there was any reason whatsoever why they shouldn't just say it. And people talk and, you know, talk all the time, and it's not even interrupting. It's like they don't stop talking. So everyone's talking all at once on top of each other. So in that way, I think I came with a background of feeling empowered to speak. And what I had to learn more was when to shut up and leave space for other people to speak and leave space for other people's ideas. It's one of my personal proverbs that people who are creative tend to have big egos. And, you know, because you have to, if you're putting something out, it's because something inside you says, I have something to say, and, you know, damn it, I'm going to say it. It's worth hearing. But there's, you know, I think we all go through, like I was saying, that writer syndrome that, yes, this is brilliant, this is genius, we're going to make the world a better place, and then, oh, this is stupid, this is crap, what am I thinking about? It's always that process of back and
There's another question coming in from Heather, aka Mermaid Reynolds. She says, in your activism, how do you get outside the acculturation to consciously reframe the story you seek to influence? For example, can you rewrite the history of conflict to create a future worth living into, like reverse social engineering?
Well, I think in some ways that's what I was trying to do with the Fifth Sacred Thing, is create that vision of the future, and then we can figure out how do we get there. I recommend to writers and to witches and magicians a book by George Lakoff called The Political Mind. I think he's one of the great theorists about language and storytelling in politics, and also that book to me really is a great textbook on magic. If you think of magic as the art of changing consciousness at will, which is the definition I've always loved from Dion Fortune. And one of the things he talks about is the question of frame, that the frame is like the overarching metaphorical structure, and it's often unconscious, but it impacts the way that we experience every political issue. And, you know, for example, he talks about the frame of talking about tax relief. You know, when you hear that, you don't think of it as a metaphor, but it is. It implies taxes are some onerous, painful, terrible thing we have to be relieved from. And what he says is if the progressives, you know, buy into the framework of tax relief that the right wing always puts out, there's no way they can win. Talk about more tax relief or less tax relief, but the only way you can actually win is by changing the frame and saying, you know, talking about maybe investment in the future. We're talking about everyone paying their fair share. We're talking about, you know, mutual shared abundance or something anyway, but you have to create your own frame. With climate change, I always tell people, you know, I think of it not about carbon numbers, but I like to think of it as massive ecosystem degradation around the globe. And that means the counter to it is massive ecosystem regeneration, which includes our human ecosystems, politics and economics and social systems. And the good news is we actually know how to do that. We know how to do it with plants. We know how to do it with land that's desertifying. We know how to do it with grasslands, forests. There's many, many, you know, wonderful, hopeful, optimistic examples of where that's been done. You know, but problems are not the technology and they're not the knowledge. The problems are, you know, our political will. So thinking about how you want to frame an issue. How do you frame it so it's going to actually further your ends? And what are the frames that are already out there that people are using, you know, that, you know, to be aware of them and to be aware of not falling into them. It's, you know, it's part of the work of developing strategy and developing, you know, political message and language. It's fun and it's challenging. It's not easy to do. I see a question about live storytelling. How do I develop the kind of things without text, or are they scripted? Most of the time when I do things, they're not scripted per se. I very rarely write a speech and read.
Do you think you could tell people, because I'm thinking I know what Micah's probably talking about, which is your yearly spiral dance ritual. Maybe you could tell people what that is and give them some context to the question.
Yeah, so the spiral dance is probably our biggest, most theatrical ritual. We just had it on the 26th, and it was really beautiful and amazing, and extremely challenging because it happened to be the day that half of the Bay Area was blacked out. Winds were rising, the fire danger was extreme, the whole of Sonoma County was evacuated. It was like all this chaos was going on in the world all around us. And we were there preparing our ritual that we've been planning for months and months. But the ritual itself was beautiful and it all went off amazingly. You know, it was like this little island of loveliness in the middle of the apocalypse. It's happening. But that is a mix of scripted and unscripted. So there's a chorus, there are songs that are written, there's a litany that is written and that's sung, and there's also invocations and things that are improvised, that people speak and people say, and there's generally part of it is a trance journey that someone leads, where we, in our imagination, travel across to the island of the West, the land of the dead, and have a chance to visit with our relatives, with our beloved dead, to gain help and to do some magical working. So the way that works is collectively, we do a visioning somewhere usually in the spring, and out of that we craft an intention. And an intention for a ritual, or I think also for something like a movie, a story, a play, a political action, I think it's helpful to have a really clear intention, but it's also surprisingly difficult for people to grasp what an intention is and is not. Because an intention is not like a list of all the things you're going to do in the ritual. And it's not like a page of flowery prose and beautiful metaphors. What an intention really is one sentence, without too many clauses, that tells people why you're doing the ritual, what is at stake, what is the change that you are attempting to bring about, how is the world going to be different if you do this ritual than if you don't. So it might be as simple as, I'm doing a ritual to heal my friend, send some healing energy, or I'm doing a ritual to honor my child's passage from being a child to being an adolescent, or it might be something more complex. And I'm also sort of a stickler for one coherent metaphor per intention. So, I say, like, you can weave a vision of the future, or you can step out onto a new road, or you can brew up a cauldron of change, but you cannot brew up a cauldron and weave a vision of the future while dancing off into, like, you've got to pick one coherent metaphor. And I think that's helpful in writing and storytelling in general. At least one metaphor per sentence or one metaphor per paragraph, because that's going to give the work more coherence. So this year, after a lot of discussion, the intention that we came up with was to reclaim the golden thread of magic that spans time and draw from the lessons of the past to weave a just and vibrant future. And so I was happy because it was one sentence, granted a few extra clauses, but that's the collective process. But I had one coherent metaphor, and that made it very easy to weave a trance, to weave magic. We had an actual physical golden thread someone literally spun. We had aerial dancers. We had, lots of different invocations, and everyone could use the thread, do something with it. And I could weave it into the trance, which I was leading this year because it was the 40th anniversary. So I get to do it every 5 or 10 years, because we like to pass these things around. And it gives the ritual a sense of coherence when you do that, when you find the right metaphor, the right image for it. In terms of live storytelling, again, for me, it's a lot. When I tell a story or I give a talk, or I lead a trance, it's like I have an architecture in my mind. I kind of like, it's like a place I've visited before, so I kind of know how to get there and I know where I'm going, but I don't have a set script for it. I feel like it's more alive that way and things come more that way. Some people do like to have more of a set structure or a written script. And I think that can work for some things, but I think especially for trance or for ritual, I feel like it works better if people allow themselves to open up to the inspiration of the moment. And in terms of the audience, it's a matter of really feeling and sensing the energy, allowing yourself to be aware of the audience and the quality of attention, and noticing what kind of impact you're having. Really like thinking out even just things as simple as, do people actually understand what you're talking about? You know, I'm always amazed at people who are in, like permaculture people who are talking to a bunch of general audience, and they'll start talking about, you know, stacking functions and, you know, using all this permaculture jargon that nobody else has ever heard of. And, you know, that ability maybe to just project some empathy and think about, or we do this in political world all the time, where, you know, the language changes all the time, and we're talking about, you know, like I remember the first time I was giving a talk somewhere, and somebody who had invited me, you know, wrote and said, you know, well, this is a very sophisticated group and they're really well versed in feminist intersectionality, and I hope you're aware of that. And I'm like, oh, of course, absolutely. I'm like, what the hell is that? I have never heard of that before. I had to go Google it. I'm like, oh, that, right. Yeah. Of course, we've been talking about that for 30 years, right? Just hadn't heard the term before. So not assuming that everybody already knows what you're talking about. Because language is, you know, language can be used as a way to inform and connect, but we also often use language as like a marker of who belongs and who doesn't belong. And that's one of the things I'm always wary about in political groups and spiritual groups. You know, maybe, you know, we spend a lot of time policing each other's language in the political realms, and I find that actually very destructive, because it's really about drawing lines and excluding and telling people they don't belong, often more than it is about actually educating people. So I see a question, what idea needs to be addressed first? I'm not sure. How do I choose an idea? How do I choose what is the most important to write? I don't know, right? I would say more an idea chooses me. You know, find a question again that it's like, if I actually have an idea, like if I have something to say, something where I feel like I have an answer, then I'll write nonfiction. I'll write, you know, I'll go and research it or back it up or whatever, but I'll write prose about it, nonfiction. But if I'm going to write fiction, it's because I don't know the answer. It's because I have a question, and it's bugging me, and it's bothering me, and I don't have a clear idea of how to approach it. And that, to me, is what makes it rich and interesting. But I don't know if I choose the one that's most important to write. I just choose the one that is most interesting to me at the moment. So, well, we're getting to the end of the hour, and my battery's starting to wear down.
Okay. Do we have, I just want to see if we have any more questions that are coming in. What is your spiritual foundation or outlook that allows you to stay grounded in the sacred feminine while society continues to degrade the earth environment and silence the feminine?
You know, I guess my spiritual outlook is the goddess, is Wicca, is paganism mixed with some Judaism. And but it basically comes out of the understanding that everything is interconnected, that we are part of a living being, which is the earth, and that the earth is sacred in the sense of really, really important. And so it's not, you know, the way that I stay grounded is not so much a belief, but it's a practice that I take time every day to ground. I try to take time every day to spend some time in nature, connecting with the natural world, watching, looking, listening, being aware, being present to what nature is telling me. And I think it is really helpful to have a practice. And they don't call it practice for nothing, right? Because you practice. It's not like it ever gets perfect, but the practice itself, develops, you could say, the spiritual muscle or the energetic pathways that help you stay grounded in moments of tension.
Sasha's got a question. She said, you touched on the challenges of making space to write and money. How do you keep your creative life juicy amid survival, money making, life exhaustion, and more practice?
Well, I think the spending time in nature always rejuvenates me, right? And having community to celebrate with is part of what helps keep it alive and energizing.
Thank you, thank you.
Great.
We have a little ritual. We don't even know that we have this ritual because this is all of our first time, but we do at the end. We got one more question's coming through, where we anchor in the things that we really want to take away. So as Starhawk looks at this last question and considers if she's going to answer or not, the rest of us are going to just take a moment just to gather in and reflect on, this was, a lot, so much just came towards us. And I like how the reference of it comes like it's arrows. Some of it lands in us, some of it goes to the side, some of it like right at the moment, some of it we want we really want to anchor it in. What do we want to walk away with? What do we want to try to put into practice? Or what do we just really want to remember? We're at the beginning of the 7-month course, and this was, there's so much richness on this was like real talk. I've so appreciated the real talk of what does it take to be a creator and create that creative space and live in the world at the same time, in our world, while also having not choose to be a creator that's disconnected from the world, but a creator that's absolutely intrinsically connected to the world and times we're living in. So I invite you to listen to what is it that you want to anchor in. And I'm going to ask and invite you to speak out loud this piece, because whatever you're helping us all anchor in and place into our collective memory, because we all grabbed hold of different pieces. So it's really helpful when you speak out loud what you want to claim and really continue learning from. And Starhawk, do you want to answer this last question, or should we move on?
I learned a fairy creation myth from Victor Anderson, and my own creation myth is what I've written about in The Earth Path. That's really sort of more the poetic retelling of what science teaches us about the beginnings of the universe, evolution.
All right, so I'm going to put everybody on. Can you stay with us for 5 more minutes while we do this, Starhawk? Does that work for you?
I think so.
Do you have
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we do a proper goodbye before you have to leave. So I'm putting everyone in gallery view so I can see your hands. And so if you are ready, I'm going to invite you to say what you're anchoring in, and just being I know that everyone's going to want to say thank you to Starhawk because it's just kind of what we want to do. But also just realize that if we all literally say thank you, then we don't get to the meat of it all. So we will do a proper, delicious gratitude send off. For this point, it's really just saying that word, that phrase, that piece that you're really claiming that you received today that you want to anchor in. And you can just raise your hand and I'll call on you. And then we'll get to hear your voice.
Actually, while you do that, I'm going to try to move back in and see if I can plug back in if it's gotten a little quieter.
Okay. Joanne.
Hi. Can you hear me? Oops.
Yes. And also,
Oh,
I'm just going to, and you don't have to say, can you hear me? Because we're going to start waving hysterically if we can't. So
okay.
we will assume that we can all hear you.
Okay. What jumped out, a word, nature. And when Starhawk first started talking about, and she was in the cafe and she talked about the process of it's great, it's awful. And what I really received from her, and thank you for this, is just to do it and not let the critic. Don't stop, don't let anything, just don't stop, do it. So I guess it would be do it, love it, nature. Okay. And I guess that's yeah.
Great.
Work.
Who else?
Yeah.
Creating the energy field.
Okay, thank you.
Wrestling with the questions, that the answer lies in the story.
Having the metaphor and having a specific narrow focus.
Yeah, that's right. One metaphor in one sentence, one paragraph, one page. I really appreciate that. Sound clear advice.
Using language to connect instead of exclude, or just using language to connect.
Thank you.
Speak my voice for nature because nature is the only thing that's real.
Thank you.
Looking at becoming more conscious of the unconscious frameworks in my life, the overarching metaphorical structures of both my belief systems and the ones that I'm promoting in my work.
Thank you.
Deciding the fiction and nonfiction, because I'm not sure about some of the stuff the stories that I want to tell. I wasn't sure which way to go with it, and I got a clear vision of her. She answered that very well. So thank you.
The solution to climate change being massive ecosystem regeneration, and that the problem is political will and not the lack of solutions or technology know-how.
I feel so comforted by that reflection that being a creative intrinsically connected in the world is challenging. And leaning into practice is the way through that.
When there is a chance to employ visual aids, find the right image to give coherence to a ritual. That seems really important to me, and I've got certain clothing that I choose to wear that has images on it that I don't necessarily call attention to, but I realize are beaming a message. I want to get better at that, elaborate on that.
I'm most affected by the example of Starhawk in that very unholding situation, and to me right now the warrior image is very cogent and very important, and I saw her embody that just You know, she didn't even say anything or react or anything. She just went on with her presentation, giving and saying what she had to say. Thank you.
Thank you for reflecting on that piece that we both saw and experienced and learned from, of what is it to stay in that seat of generosity. Absolutely. Oh my gosh, Starhawk, thank you for finding a way, even when traffic was not in your favor. I'm going to put you back on speaker view, and finding your way to bring so much richness to this first class. Okay. And I know that you're probably ready to go. So what we want to do is just to give you a proper send off. Unless there's any last thing that you would like to say before we give you a proper send off.
Well, just to say, if you go to my website, which is starhawk.org, you can sign on to my mailing list and find out about all the things I'm doing. I do lots of different kinds of courses. I'll be doing some more online courses, and I do some online rituals. We'll do one for the winter solstice that'll be coming up in December. And we do a lot of permaculture teaching. We have a whole new program in regenerative land management that we started. So I'd love to.
It starts in January.
Yeah,
the class
training starts in January, and regenerative land management program is longer term training in how to actually regenerate ecosystems. And we have an intensive starting with that in February, where we're going to do some work in Lake County, which is one of the places that has burned so much over the last few years, and do a restoration project. And yeah, and thanks. This is great, Leah. Wonderful class, wonderful group of people.
Yay. So they don't know it yet, but we have a ritual send off. Okay. And you're going to be our first one. And the way that it works is that I take everybody off mute, and we give our biggest, grandest gratitude and hurrah and celebratory thing all at once. So, stand back from your microphone because it might be a little bit loud. And here we go. I'm taking you all off mute.
Wait, we're getting time for Maya.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful to meet you.
Thank you so much.
I think I like the flies.
What did you have to say? Put everybody back on mute. Look, there's even flowers being thrown in your direction. All right.